Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this absolutely fantastic AMA with Professor Vinton Cerf. You probably all know who he is. We certainly had a lot of questions from you all to be posing to Professor over the next 3/4 of an hour. But anyway, I'm just going to give you a potted version, I think, of his CV and his immense experience. He's currently Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google. He contributes to global policy development and has as his aim the continued spread of the internet. And together with Bob Kahn, he brought into being the TCP and IP architecture, which is the basis of the internet as we know it today. He's a recipient of numerous accolades, including the US Presidential Medal of Freedom, and the ACM Turing Award. So, Professor Cerf, thank you so much again for agreeing to be part of this Ask Me Anything session. Startup Scale Up, we explained to you just before joining, it's a startup accelerator for companies that are focused on the Internet of Things. We have 49 startups with us at the moment, and we'll be shortly opening up our recruitment process to invite a further 80 to join the program. We've got 4 hubs across the EU, Madrid, Cartagena here in Spain. We've got Dublin, Zoetermeer just outside Amsterdam, and Vilnius in Eastern Europe. So we have people from all over, not just Europe, but the world participating in this. And as I say, we're very, very excited to have you here with us today. So the first thing is that there are very many definitions for the Internet of Things. Some of them are quite technical. But for a layperson like myself, the thing that I like the most is that it's essentially a new paradigm in which intelligent connected objects gather data, they analyze that data, and then they decide of the course of action. I think that's absolutely fantastic, you know, that this autonomous action for the benefit and to do things that will basically make our life easier is just really, really exciting. Over the very many facets of the internet generally, and then the Internet of Things, what have you seen that you think is the most interesting use, if you like, of the Internet of Things?
Well, first of all, let me start out by thanking you for the opportunity to chat with everyone. Second, I want to add to the list that you gave of various awards, because one of them I consider to be very significant for this audience in particular, and that's the Prince of Asturias Award in 2002, which I received with Bob Kahn and 2 others, Larry Roberts and Tim Berners-Lee, whom some of you will know was the inventor of the World Wide Web. With regard to the Internet of Things, it seems like many definitions have arisen, none of which are exactly right. Let me just start out by observing that over time, we have increasingly chosen to use computing capability to replace mechanical control of a variety of appliances. This goes all the way from things like microwave ovens and washing machines to automobiles whose engines are classically controlled by a fairly big chip, which is monitoring the condition of the engine and the brakes and the oil pressure and the air pressure and the tires and so on, and used in order to make the vehicle perform better. So these are closed systems, generally speaking. They're not connected to the outside world, and yet they take an advantage of the fact that you can program things in order to make devices operate. If we now add to this the possibility of communication through the internet to the cloud, for example, to applications running in the cloud, to mobiles and applications running on mobiles, we open up yet another door for interaction and control, as well as monitoring. It gets even more interesting as you start thinking about devices that interact with each other in a peer-to-peer basis, or cooperate with each other, or exchange information in order to achieve a particular objective. To give you a very simple example, Google has or I should say Alphabet now, has a company called Google, but it also has another company called Nest as part of the Alphabet soup. And Nest makes devices like thermostats and fire alarms. One of the interesting things about the thermostat is it tries to learn whether or not you're home, and if you're not home, it tries to reduce the heating or cooling in order to save energy, but it only wants to do that if it knows you're not home. So it needs to know that you're in a not at home state. The problem with this is that the sensors that are incorporated into the actual fire alarms or the thermostats don't necessarily detect presence of people in every room in the house. So now there are additional devices that we'll call beacons that can be used to detect motion, for example, and therefore inform the devices that need to know, are you anywhere at home or not, whether they should go into this not at home mode. This is just an example of the kind of cooperative activity which becomes possible when you allow for local communication among these devices, and then of course communication back to monitoring systems that might be part of the internet or the internet cloud. This gets interesting when you start linking devices that consume electricity, for example, to the power companies who are trying to figure out, how do I manage the load so that there is no more demand on my generating capability than what I already have or can get access to. So I'm sure that many of the startup engineers know that you have an electric grid. There are multiple generators of power. Everything is all connected together. And some generation facilities will borrow energy from others if they can't meet the demand. Of course, the grid has to be configured in order to allow that much energy to flow from sources of generation to sources of consumption. But when you reach capacity and you can no longer supply the demand in power, if the demand continues to increase, the voltage levels sag, for example, or you get frequency and phase variations. It's not only harmful to the grid, but the devices that are depending on power don't get it when they need it. So the question is, can I tell a device, please don't make any more demands on me, I'm at the peak load now. So if you're a water heater, and if your owner has programmed you to say, listen to this demand response request, consider not heating the water for the next 10 or 15 minutes, or not running the air conditioner for the next 20 minutes in order to avoid a meltdown or a brownout or a blackout. So this is called demand response in the United States, and I'm sure it has other terms for people who are in other parts of the world. But the idea is that there is now cooperation between the electricity consuming device and the electricity generating device. This gets even more interesting when you start thinking about local power generation, whether it's solar power or wind power or thermal power, or even conventional diesel generators or natural gas generators that are connected to the grid. There are a number of homes that use solar power to offset their demand for city energy, for example. Now, what that means is that the grid now has multiple sources of electricity pushing into the grid as well as consuming, which requires even more control in order to stabilize the system. So now we see again and again that the introduction of communication and programming for a variety of devices, in this case, in the case of electricity producing and consuming devices, creates a big opportunity for more efficient use of energy, but it also creates a huge challenge when it comes to writing software that can manage this complex interaction in a stable way. Now let me switch to another set of challenges that the Internet of Things produces. It may not be obvious, but even the simplest of measurements may turn out to have privacy considerations that need to be of concern. For example, in my house, I have an IPv6 radio-based mesh network, which is sampling. Each one of the devices are sampling temperature, humidity, and the level of light in each room in the house every 5 minutes, and then transmitting through this self-forming mesh network to a receiver and server in my basement. And you might say, why would anybody do that? And the honest answer is every geek is curious about how well his ventilation and air conditioning system works. And at the end of the year, I have very good engineering information about how well I have heated or cooled the rooms in the house and how stable the effect has been. What is important, though, is to recognize that if someone else got access to my 5-minute samples of temperature and humidity and light levels, They might be able to infer from that data how many people live in the house, what rooms do they occupy, are they home or not, and or at least discover diurnal patterns that might let them predict whether I'm home or not. And if you're a robber, for example, that's very valuable information. So I'd be pretty stupid if I would to allow that data to be transmitted in the open. If you're sufficiently paranoid, you'll use encryption in order to make sure the data only gets usefully to the thing you intended to get to. So now we start to realize that in the Internet of Things, these devices have to be instructed who should be allowed to give them control information and commands, so to speak, and to whom should information be accessible. Should a device refuse to communicate with something it doesn't recognize as valid in accordance with the owner's wishes? So security and safety and privacy become an element of IoT design concern. And more generally, if we're speaking about building codes, if we're speaking about legal processes, legal frameworks, what should the producer of a device that's included in the Internet of Things rubric incorporate into the software, into the hardware, in order to protect the interests of users? And these interests are not just privacy, they're clearly safety. I mean, if you have a device which is controlled by software and might be accessed remotely, and whose malfunction might cause serious damage, like burning the house down, for example, or electrocuting someone unintentionally, then you really have to start thinking seriously about the safety of the system, of the ensemble. Can someone introduce an external effect that would degrade the safety of the system or degrade its privacy? Now, let me turn this around for a moment and show you that why this problem is so complex. Let's go back to the example of my system at home, which I'm monitoring for HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. Let us imagine for a moment, God forbid, that the house is on fire. Well, at this point, this is a special consideration. The fire alarm system has gone off, the fire department has been called, and as they're en route to the house, they might actually benefit from having access to video cameras inside the house, other sensor mechanisms to know where's the fire, is there anyone who's in the house, do we know what rooms they're in. For safety's sake, that information needs to get to the fire department, or perhaps the house has been alarmed for burglaries and no one is at home, and the burglar alarm goes off because an entry has been detected, which is signaled by the alarm system. The police department is on its way. They might benefit from having access to internal cameras inside the house, the ability to turn the lights on, to do a variety of things which you would normally not want anyone to do except you, except under this one circumstance. The house has been broken into. You want the authorities to have access. So this is a very complex environment in which to write software, to make decisions, to impose control on the way in which the systems work. Now let me make this even more complicated. I think a number of the people who are participating in this call are considering making devices and applications that fall into this general category of Internet of Things. And imagine for a moment that you're a consumer and you like these devices and you buy a bunch of them from different providers, and now you're faced with configuring and managing them, and there is no uniformity in the protocols that are being used and the access controls and other kinds of elements. And now this poor consumer has, let's say, purchased devices from a dozen different providers and is spending the entire day or week or whatever typing IPv6 addresses into some control program in order to configure all these devices. What we need here is some uniformity. We really need to have some agreement about how the devices can be communicated with, how can they be configured, how can they be told whose control to accept, to whom or to which IP address, should they be sending any information at all. What are the mechanisms for strong authentication between the devices and between the control systems and the sampling systems. So we are all, as eager as we are to develop our products and get them out the door, we really need to think about the consumer faced with a variety of sources of equipment. having to live through this. So whether we like it or not, standards are going to become very important. Standards for strong authentication are going to be very important. Standards for strong crypto are going to be important because of its ability to protect our privacy. And as some of you may or may not be following the situation with Apple and the American FBI, there are disputes over the conditions under which all those privacy and security protections should be broken, and under what circumstances and for what reason and by whom. And so all of this has to be kind of lumped together into the basic and fundamental question of, does this device actually work? Which, by the way, is priority number one. Does it work? Priority number two, is it reliable? Priority number three, is it safe? Four is secure, and fifth is what I'd say, and private. Does it preserve privacy? I mean, these are all considerations that have to be incorporated into any serious thinking about the Internet of Things. Well, let me stop there. That was a rather long answer to your first question, but I hope you get the drift of what I'm thinking anyway about this particular new opportunity.
Well, actually, that was a fantastic answer, because I think you've covered at least 6 other questions that I have already from startups. So, and very specifically on security and on protocols, there'll be some further questions in a little while. But I just wanted to come back to the value of the IoT, and more specifically in terms of its use to society, because of course we're all hearing about autonomous cars, about the home hubs, and about how you can have energy efficiency within your home and control your costs, and obviously there are savings there for society at large in terms of, you know, the emission of noxious gases, etc., etc. But beyond that, have you seen any really innovative uses or potential use cases of IoT that are perhaps, I was thinking of, in Europe, you probably, I imagine you have heard that we've had a refugee crisis with people coming over from Syria. I'm kind of thinking, is there any role there for IoT? Is there something that we can really use to solve a greater social problem? Not that I'm not saying that energy efficiency isn't, because clearly it is, but just something that's really different.
Well, excuse me. I'm getting over a cold, and I hope I can't transmit this particular virus through the net. So first of all, you're asking for a fairly big answer, and let me tell you that often these technologies tend not to have their biggest effect until they're widespread, until you can rely on their use in a broad sense. But let me come back to the refugee question for a moment, and then I want to talk about a medical side to this. On the refugee question, I've been quite surprised to learn that the first thing that the refugees ask for when they arrive at some safe place is not food, shelter, and you know, or even medical help. They ask whether there is Wi-Fi available. Many of them have mobile phones with internet capability. Their first consideration is, how do I get access to the internet? How do I get access to information? How do I get access to my families to let them know where I am and how I am? I was very surprised to learn that. And it's the first question is, where's the Wi-Fi? Now let me switch to something which doesn't require necessarily huge widespread implementation in order to have a fairly dramatic effect on a very personal basis. And these are devices that you wear for medical monitoring purposes. Some of you, I'm sure, are aware of things like insulin pumps, which are sampling the state of glucose in your blood and deciding how much insulin to pump in. That information turns out to be valuable both in the instant, that is to say, if you are in need of more insulin because you're eating or exercising, the system can detect that. But if we can track that information, if the device will also supply that to, for example, an app in a mobile, then if we can track this moment-by-moment behavior, we can correlate that with you know, how much movement is involved. Are you running? Are you sitting? Are you, well, what else? Are you walking up and down stairs? We're starting to get an idea of what is normal for you as a person. in terms of exercise and use of energy. That means that we can establish a kind of norm for you based on measurements, and we can then be looking for variations from the norm to say, uh-oh, you know, this is out of normal range, there may be something wrong, we should alert either the user himself or herself, or alert the doctor, or alert a family member. But this idea of monitoring on a continuous basis can be very, very powerful for understanding how our own bodies are working for us. So that's one very sort of a very personal example, individual example of how we could make a big difference. I think there may be an additional thing for us to think about, and that's feedback to us about the consequences of our behavior and our choices. The medical side is one obvious one, but there's another, and it's associated with our use of energy and resources. By monitoring on a continuous basis how we use resources, whether it's water or gasoline or electricity or other consumables, we begin to reflect back to the user the consequences of what they choose to do and how they choose to do it. And often this kind of reflection gives us a basis for changing our decisions, changing our choices. For example, if it were possible for us to say, you chose to drive to work today and you injected this much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, your alternative might have been to ride a bike, which would have made you more healthy, or to drive an electric car if you could afford that, or take public transportation. This sort of feedback that says, here's how much you're harming or helping the environment can also change people's behavior. They won't change unless they actually are confronted with the consequences of their behavior and their personal decisions, as opposed to one of these very general reports saying that 25% of the country could choose an alternative transportation and it would reduce the level of pollution, but you don't know if you're in the 25%. So this personal feedback is a very powerful tool, and the people who are thinking about building IoT devices and applications should be thinking along those terms as well. How can I use my product or service to influence people's decisions in a way which is beneficial not only for them, but for everyone else as well?
I think that's absolutely fascinating from a parental point of view as well. You're continuously telling your children, there's action kind of consequence. And what you're saying here, that in broader societal terms, you have data, you have action, and you have consequence, which I think is a really powerful thing to get across also to consumers of our products and services. So moving now towards Alphabet and your own strategy in terms of the Internet of Things and startups, is there anything that you can share with us there? I mean, what do you look for? Where are you finding that the kind of the best fit between what you want to do as a company and your strategic positioning and what's coming through your doors?
Well, now you've asked a question which I'm probably not the best person to try to answer. I'm not Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, and I'm certainly not Tony Fadell, who runs Nest. But I will try to give you a flavor for the way I see this. First of all, if you're building devices that are going to be network enabled and they are interacting in some fashion with the physical environment, whether they affect it or whether they sample information about it and warn you that there are noxious gases present, one of the things which is important to us is sensors. And so figuring out ways to detect things, to measure things, is very important for some classes of product. And so Google, I think, or Alphabet would be alert to that. The second thing, as I mentioned before, has to do with standardization of protocols, access control, privacy protection, cryptography, strong authentication. All of those things are of real interest. And in the long run, it's my view that we will all benefit from some commonality and standardization. There are still a very large number of different groups and different product makers with quite different design decisions that render things not very compatible. There will be a period of time when control devices might actually try to integrate multiple different protocols so that one controller can interact with a variety of different products. But in the long run, I think that almost everyone will benefit from having more common results. There is simultaneously a big opportunity for competition. If there's commonality, then everybody gets to compete on a more level basis. Of course, product makers hate that because they'd much rather have you drawn into their orbit and have to use their protocols. This happened many, many years ago in the computer networking field, where computer makers like IBM and HP and Digital Equipment Corporation had their own network protocols, and they liked the idea that it kind of locked people into buying their kind of computer, their brand of computer, if they wanted to network them together. But then the internet came along and said, wait, there's a common non-proprietary way to do this. And eventually the buyers of computers said, we like that because it gives us more choice. The same thing, I believe, will apply to the Internet of Things. Eventually there will be recognition by the consumers, if not by the manufacturers, that commonality is in their interest. And it also creates a much more powerful leveraging effect, because if you can do one thing that works for everybody, then it has a very powerful impact behind it. And that's a big opportunity for the creator of a new product or a service or an application, even though it also increases the competitive field, because everybody can try to do that. That should benefit the consumers, of course, because it increases their range of choice of things that they might incorporate into the ensemble of devices that they want to have under their control, supporting their well-being.
Okay, no, absolutely. I think that's one of the key things that all our startups are finding, that the lack of standards sometimes actually makes it too difficult to not spend too much time on certain basic elements, and you don't really know where the market's going to evolve, so it's difficult to know how to program and along what lines. And in that respect, there's a follow-on question. How do you think the IoT is going to change the relationships that corporates have with startups, precisely because of this need to integrate things that aren't necessarily made kind of in-house, and to be able to take advantage of a market that's going to be very, very broad, but only if you have that level of interoperability? How do you see that developing?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, because it touches on another aspect of all this, and it's the difference between established companies and startups. Many of the people participating in this call are probably familiar with The Innovator's Dilemma. It's a very interesting book, which talks about how hard it is to innovate inside a corporate environment, which has a set of business practices and products, and it's supporting particular profit and loss lines, and some new idea that comes along that might disrupt one of their businesses or one of their product lines is often not welcome, because the people who are wedded to that line say, go away, I don't want you to mess up my business. On the other hand, a startup is all about disruption. It's all about doing something new. It's all about innovation, because if you had no innovation, why are you starting up? So the question now is, well, how do we balance that? And one of the balancing factors is that the startup with the new idea may not have resources to actually execute, which is why funding is always a challenge for any startup. How much runway do I have in terms of paying for my employees before I have to be airborne or I die? And I'm sure nobody likes to hear this, but 80 to 90% of all startups fail. And they fail because they ran out of money, typically, or they misjudged the market, or somebody came along with a better idea and raced them to the finish line. So what this means is that a startup really has to be thinking about, how do I get from where I am to where I become successful? Some of them think that the fastest way to get there is to become an acquisition of an already established company, and I suspect there are a number of people who would love to be acquired by Google, for example. On the other hand, figuring out a way to get adequate resource in order to make a successful new product and really break into the field is a big challenge, but it has bigger benefits in the end. If you're a very successful company like Google, for example, then you do attract a great deal of resource. Now, in Google's case, everybody understands that the original product was search, and they did it really well. I mean, there have been many search engines before Google, but what was called the back rub when Larry and Sergey were at Stanford is now called Google. And at the beginning, they had a really good search product, and they had no business model. So it's not at all clear how the heck this thing was going to be supported. The small team that started the company included someone who figured out that advertising might actually be a way of making this work. And even though there had been earlier attempts at banner ads, it did not work out well. This one worked because the ads that were shown were related to the search terms you were using. And that linkage, plus some very, very clever business tactics, like we don't charge you if nobody clicks on your ad and so on, added up to a very, very successful business model. So one of the things that the startups need to be seriously thinking about is, what does our business model look like? How do we really make money? How do I explain that to the venture capital people whose resources we may require in order to reach product takeoff? Business model, I'm just an engineer, but I have to tell you that business models have become a central point of interest, because in the absence of a successful business model, it's very hard to make a successful company. There's an old adage that says, don't spend more money than you make. And there's another one that says, don't confuse capital for revenue. There are a lot of companies who are starting up who see capital coming in, and they think, oh, here's all the money we can spend. And when they spend it all and then they run out, they wonder what happened. And the answer was, that wasn't revenue, that was capital. Capital has to turn into revenue or the company is not successful. That's a very basic economic point that it gets lost in some businesses.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And one of the key tenets, actually, and things that we are trying to work with a lot of our startups on, their revenue model. And you can have capital investment to begin with that will help you with the R&D and getting the product out there if you don't already have a product. But you still need a valid business model that generates revenue on an ongoing basis. So it's something that's glad to see that you're echoing that in what you've just said. So just moving now on to some of the security questions that we were asked to pose to you. From one of our startups, the IoT presents new challenges and new security issues. The experience of some of our startups reveals that denial of service attacks are now common on traditional internet services, while attacks through traditional viruses, worms, etc., have decreased due to improved antivirus support. What areas do you think will need to be increasingly addressed in the future? And they give some examples like zero-day exploits, state machine attacks, or vulnerabilities in legacy systems.
Well, first observation is that the vulnerabilities are going to spread across generations of software and equipment. And no matter how carefully you find patches for vulnerabilities that are the result of bugs in software, it's very hard to get all of those fixes out there into the field. Internet of Things makes it even harder in several respects. The first one is that some of these devices are not in your face very much. They're sort of in the background. They're part of the infrastructure. If you think of residential environments, you don't visit your thermostat necessarily very often, unless there's something wrong or it's not working properly. So one problem is alerting people to the need to do an update. The second one is finding an effective means of doing patching for bugs. This can get very hard if you think about some devices that we would put into the Internet of Things category that might be in use for decades. An oil furnace, for example, or a gas furnace or a water heater lasts for years, if not decades, and their software and computer-based or programmable components may actually be quite old as these devices reach their end of life. And during that long period of time, there's still a potential for vulnerability, and there's still a need for communication and update. To make matters worse, the company that made the device may go out of business. And if they go out of business, then the bugs will remain forever unless somebody picks up maintenance for that. Will they get access to the source code in order to do the maintenance? How will the device itself know whether an update is legitimate or whether it's coming from a false front source? Digital signatures now potentially are your friend, except that what happens if the company goes out of business and the private key that allows them to sign software for an update that lets the device figure out if it's legitimate, that key is lost, and now even if a third party wants to maintain the software, it doesn't have the key. So how does it do a safe update? And if you want to force the device to accept the new key, a new public key, to check the digital signature on an update, what if that's a bad guy who's exercising the here's a new legitimate key, but it isn't, and here's a new update, causes the device now to malfunction or to do more than it's supposed to. For example, the thing I always worry about, that's fictionally speaking, is a headline that says 100,000 refrigerators attack the Bank of Spain. And the reason this is scary is that the refrigerators have a fair amount of computing power in them, or they will. It'll be hard to buy a dumb chipset. And so even if the chipset is only occupied with managing the refrigerator's operation, it could probably run Linux, it could probably run a variety of other applications without disturbing the functionality of the refrigerator. So if some bad guy manages to penetrate the refrigerator's defenses, get a new piece of software into it, and so that it on the side it becomes part of a botnet, and you'd never notice that because the refrigerator is working just fine. It's not, there's no red light saying, "Hell, I've turned into a pirate." Then you might not ever know that your refrigerator is malfunctioning. And so you attack Bank of America, and to make matters worse, or Bank of Spain, and to make matters worse, the Bank of Spain decides that it's going to counterattack and ends up disabling your refrigerator, and all of your ice cream melts, and the fish, you know how bad that would be. So the whole point here is that the longevity of some of these devices, and the longevity of the company that makes them, or the willingness of the company that acquires another company to continue supporting them, is an open question and a big issue for the consumers, and maybe more fundamentally, not just for the consumers, but for the national infrastructure. Because this stuff, this software, and all these controllable devices are embedded in the infrastructure of the country at this point. And their well-being, their well-functioning, their reliability has a great deal to say about what life is like. And if they are not reliable, if they're penetrable, et cetera, then you may have a very unstable socioeconomic environment, and that's not a good thing for anybody. So, I mean, you should take this stuff really seriously, because if you're only focused on how do I get somebody to go buy my product now, and I don't care what happens to them 10 years from now, you may be digging a really big hole that nobody will be able to crawl out of. And it's not just the hole you're in, it's the hole you put everyone else in. And eventually that finger could come around and point at you. So although this is kind of scary for a new company to think about, the long-term consequences of the design of the system and its management, and possibly even its survival after your company dies, might actually be a very important thing for you to think about. And as we get more and more into this environment, and failures happen of these kinds, people are going to start asking questions about, did you think about the long-term consequences of your design? How does your product respond to that? How does your company respond to that? I'm not buying your product if you can't show me you thought about that. Are you protecting my safety, my security, and my privacy over the long term?
Well, I think that's a really interesting issue for our startups, which of course are going to be around still in 50 years and 100 years time, we hope. So they're going to clearly have to get some legal advice, presumably in terms of warranties and things that insurance, I suppose, also will have to evolve to cope with these latent liabilities that might not be evident now, but if your product, if your service is embedded in something else, then in 20 years time this may be an issue, and if you happen to have grown a lot, then you're going to be the target for lawsuits, etc., etc. So it's I think it's something that needs to be taken very, very seriously.
So let me interrupt and say that the cyber insurance is becoming increasingly of interest to the insurance community. But let me say emphatically that just because you have insurance does not mean that it fixes bugs. All this means is that you may be protected from financial liability, and that's it. In order to protect yourself, you really need to be conscious of how to fix bugs when they show up, whether you discover them or someone else does, and all the mechanisms that are associated with that, the validation of the code, etc. If we don't do that, if we pretend to ourselves that because I have cyber insurance, I don't need to do anything else, we would be a very false assumption indeed.
Okay, so insurance is no excuse not to make sure that you know exactly how to fix the bugs that might arise as your product gets integrated into larger environments and interacts with other devices as well. Now, on this point, moving back to security, whose responsibility is it, do you think, to secure the Internet of Things?
Well,
is it large companies? Is it government?
Well, I have a disappointing assertion to make for the programmers on the call. I think the programmers who write the software have the responsibility for assuring its reliability and safety and security. And I think you cannot escape this anymore. For many, many years, decades now, programmers have gotten away with murder, in my opinion. And I used to make my living writing software, so I'm including myself in this condemnation. The point is that you should feel a great weight of responsibility on your shoulders, and someday that weight will descend. Someday people will figure out, wait a minute, it's the software that is the problem. It's the weakness in the software. It's the vulnerabilities in the software. And therefore, the people who write that software should have some responsibility and liability for its failure to operate correctly. It's a complicated space because something might not work because it depended on something else, as you implied in your remarks. And so now it gets complicated as to which direction fingers are flying in. But it simply increases a corporate concern for the ensemble of software that its products and services rely upon. For example, when somebody says, well, open source is the solution to the problem, it may or may not be the case, because even though open source should be helpful, if someone had the capacity to look at it and say there's a bug here and surface that and get it fixed, that's a good thing. But when people adopt and ingest open source as part of a product, they don't necessarily know exactly where that open source came from. They may not scrutinize it carefully. There may be libraries associated with the basic source code that you haven't scrutinized carefully. The Heartbleed bug, which showed up, after decades, was an example of something that was essentially viewable but not detected by huge numbers of people until finally somebody analyzed it and discovered the bug. So I think that programmers are the key responsible parties here, and the companies who generate software or rely on somebody else's software should be conscious of that connection, that linkage, and that responsibility and liability. I'm pretty sure that over time, governments are going to say the well-being of our citizens includes safety of the software that they use, and if you're making that software, then you have to be responsible for that, or you have to be able to say something strong about its safety. Let me just say that the academics don't escape this either. And the reason is that the tools we use for writing software obscure the mistakes that we make. Unless we go to the trouble of building programming tools and environments that will help expose stupid mistakes like buffer overflows and things like, or use of a variable that's never been written into, then it's our fault. Shame on us. So the academic world can contribute a great deal by creating tools that make it more apparent that mistakes have been made, or that allow the programmer to make assertions like, there are no buffer overflows in this code, and have the software, which is sort of perched on the shoulder looking at the programmer's work, saying, wait, you can't say that because there's this problem over here. That's asking the software to operate at a rather high level of intelligence, and whether we ever get there is still unknown. But the idea that our software could be more helpful in exposing mistakes or allowing us to test assertions about our software would be very welcome. There are a few tools like this that are starting to emerge. One of them is called COQ, C-O-Q, which is a French development. And another, these are not exclusive, but it's just one that immediately comes to mind. There's another one called TLA, which probably stands for three-letter acronym because the engineers who designed it couldn't think of a name, so they called it TLA. But it's been used, excuse me, it's been used to good advantage at Amazon, for example, and maybe Microsoft and others. So we should be thinking about that, and the companies that are on the call who are looking for ways to demonstrate that they are thinking and taking action, doing due diligence along this axis of safety and security, might want to think about that, because it's evidence of having taken reasonable measures to assure that the software is doing what it's supposed to do. And that can become a defense against a claim of negligence.
Well, I think we'll be incorporating that into the next acceleration program that we prepare. I'll make sure that we'll have some session specifically dedicated on this to make sure that our startups are aware of the importance. And I particularly like what you say about the due diligence. It's nobody's got a crystal ball, but it's I don't know will it be enough or not, but at least it's something if you can demonstrate that you've taken reasonable steps to prevent your product causing harm in the future because of failure, because of unreliability, because it's let something else come into the system. So I think that this just brings us to one of our very last questions, which is clearly technology is progressing, ever faster. It's absolutely amazing. Things like artificial intelligence. Maybe soon we'll have software that programs itself and repairs itself, so we don't have to worry about updating things. That will just happen automatically. But do you believe that the societal fear about what can happen in this brave new world will outstrip our ability to or our capability to engineer new things and come up with new products and services? Do you think basically fear will stall progress?
No, I don't think so, but let me see if I can frame this in several ways. First of all, the existing environment is so complex that nobody can really fully understand what's going on. Every time two devices on the internet talk to each other, it's a whole new experiment. And the reason for this is quite simple. Almost every device I can think of has a complement of software on it which is different from every other device. Even if you're running your laptop, it's a Macintosh and it's running a particular Apple operating system, you've ingested various and sundry bits and pieces of code in your browser or in the operating system, and you've got varying generations of operating systems running. So that plus all the Internet of Things devices, which themselves have different patch levels and so on, every one of these interactions is, in a sense, another experiment. So there are billions of experiments that happen every single day on the internet, nobody knowing exactly what the outcome is going to be. And failures will occur. So I don't think anyone has the ability to omnisciently understand what's going on, which means that it's not like a problem for the future, it's today's problem. Second observation I would make is that the artificial intelligence mechanisms that we have evolved so far, including some of the very impressive results coming out of the Alphabet company DeepMind recently, was getting it to play Go and beat a significant master player. These kinds of programs, while they learn how to perform even in a complex game like Go, are still honing their intelligence against a fairly fixed space. It may be a large space, but the game is a fixed space of interaction. It's the internet, and the Internet of Things is not like a Go game. It's a much more complex environment. So expecting the artificial intelligence tools of the present to cope on their own with this kind of complexity, I think, is way out of scope. On the other hand, I will say that the feedback loops that come from measurement against certain criteria are things that could be learned by some of these algorithms. And so by providing these artificial intelligence mechanisms with measured data against some set of criteria, may in fact cause patterns to emerge or responses to be learned that we might not have figured out ourselves. And this is very true, especially for classification, for facial recognition, for object and image understanding, and so, or at least image segmentation, may in fact actually be quite powerful. So in the long run, I don't fear artificial intelligence in the ways that some of other contemporaries have said. I see these as tools for us to make use of. But it is very clear right now that, at least to me, and I'm not necessarily an expert in AI, but I think that it is not the case that we fully understand what happens when we use these multi-layer neural networks to learn to play a Go game or learn to play a lot of these other board games. We see their successes, but we don't necessarily fully understand how the various weights and feedback loops evolve. Now, what this is sort of telling us is that our brains function in ways that we don't completely understand, and we're building devices that we also don't completely understand. And that does lead to this kind of uneasy feeling that we're in a space now where we're inventing stuff which we can't possibly understand. And so that raises the question, well, if we don't understand it, how can we trust it? And I don't know the answer to that, to be honest with you. I almost want to have, what is that wonderful quote? Quid custodiet, que custodies, or something. My Latin is terrible, but who will watch the watchers is the translation. If we start creating artificially intelligent devices, do we need more devices to watch them to warn us that our artificially intelligent device has done something wrong, has gone rogue, or has motivations that we didn't intend? I have no idea, but this is probably a great substance for another science fiction television series.
I think you're absolutely right there. I'm actually at the World Mobile Congress here in Barcelona, and the amount of devices or products that already have feedback loops incorporated is actually quite astounding. So it'll be interesting to see where we are. There's an event that's called 4 years from now. It'll be interesting to see that and how we develop. So a very last parting shot, which is a word of wisdom for entrepreneurs interested in the Internet of Things. What would be the one piece of advice you would give to our startups to build a successful company?
The same word 3 times: focus, focus, focus. The problem with a startup is sometimes that you encounter what we call insurmountable opportunities. Too many different possible choices to make, and failing to stay focused on 1 or 2 or something is usually what kills a lot of startups. They get distracted by possibilities, and they don't stay focused on getting a product out the door. And so stay focused, pick your line and go, as otherwise you may essentially disperse your assets and resources too widely and not actually produce the result that you hope for.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Cerf. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear you talk. I mean, to be honest, we could be here for hours and hours and hours, but I'm sure that you have very many other demands on your time, and you certainly need to nurse your cold so that you're fit and able for your next session, which I'm sure will be very, very shortly. Thank you very much, everyone who's participated for Startup Scale Up, for your questions. We'll be taking up many of these issues in the individual sessions that we have with you in the hubs. And of course, we'll be incorporating them into the next acceleration program. So if you have any other issues that you'd like to raise with us so that we can have maybe mini discussions around these themes, then please let us know and we'll find the time to do that.
I look forward to that very much. Many thanks. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Adios. Adios.
Thank you very much.